They said the desert could swallow a name by noon. Yet the wind that morning kept circling back to one, as if unwilling to let it go. Saka. It lifted sand in thin, glittering threads, traced the black scorches where iron had spoken, skimmed over shattered canteens and splintered hafts, and returned again and again to the narrow ravine where a woman lay with her eyes half closed and her jaw set like a blade. She did not move when the light changed. She measured day the way wounded animals do, by warmth creeping over skin that could not hide, by shadows geometred across stone, by the patience of thirst. Somewhere above, a hawk stitched the sky with a dark needle. Somewhere below, ants labored as if there were time for everything. There was not. She knew this the way she knew the shape of her own name, intimately, without permission. The blast had ended quickly, which was a better mercy than most. She remembered only light, then sound, then the sudden absence of both her legs, as if the earth had decided it would carry only so much of her from that moment on. In the first lull, her brother's hands had been steady enough to do what love in terrible hours requires: a heated blade, a strip of leather, a bundle quick and tight. He had not said, "Forgive me." He had said, "Breathe." Then the soldiers pressed from the west, and his breath went with the others into the hills. He left a skin of water, a length of rawhide, a small, trembling promise that he would come back if the trail turned. The trail did not turn. She did not die that day. Sometimes endurance is not courage, so much as the body refusing to learn a cruel lesson. When noon arrived, she drank in sips that the tongue barely noticed, tied the rawhide around what remained of her thighs, and counted her heartbeats out loud until numbers meant nothing, and the rhythm meant everything. When evening came, she welcomed it as a stranger who brought cool hands and no talk. When night fell, it did not fall like a blessing, only like a softer version of the same sentence. On the second day, fever found her. It was a quiet animal at first, nosing at the edges of her thought. Then it was in her, licking the bowl of her skull, calling up old songs in a tongue she had learned from women who braided hair and thunder in the same breath. She saw faces whose names she had not spoken in years, and faces whose names she would never learn because iron had forgotten to ask. She saw her brother as a boy, running through grass that reached his knees, a smear of sun on his cheek, and heard him laugh the way children do when the world is uncomplicated by law. She opened her mouth to tell him something simple and good. The wind took the words and hid them. Ants found her before mercy did. Tiny emissaries, tireless, curious. She flicked them away when she could. When she could not, she let them travel until the tickle turned to annoyance, and the annoyance turned to a kind of focused anger that warmed her better than the sun. A fly landed near the corner of her mouth. She hissed it off like a cat guarding its last corner of shade. At noon, a vulture circled and decided she was not yet a promise worth keeping. She thanked it out loud and laughed at herself for the courtesy. The laugh surprised her, small, cracked, disobedient. It shook something free in her chest. She tipped her head and watched the light move deeper into the ravine, the way a child watches water and believes it means abundance every time. If old injury had written itself across her body, older pride lived there too. She reached down with shaking hands and fought the torn cloth of her dress into a shape that kept her covered. Dignity, she told herself, is not for the living room. It's for the places where nothing is gentle. She tore a strip from the inside hem, soaked it with what little water she had, and pressed it along a line where skin had split from heat. She whispered a word her grandmother had used when tending scratches and childbirth and grief alike. A word that meant, "Hush now, heal now, we are still here." It steadied her breath. It did not ask for miracles. In the afternoon, somewhere far off, metal spoke again. No conversation, just a punctuation. She listened for the echo, and hearing where it fell, knew she would not see her people by sundown. The knowledge did not break her. It settled through her carefully, like sand seeking level, and left a stillness that felt almost like instruction. The heart, after pain, does not always want to be brave. Sometimes it only wants permission to be quiet without apology. She gave herself that permission. She closed her eyes and sorted the day into piles. What I can do, what I cannot, what the wind must handle, what the dark will teach me. She could move her arms. She could drink in sips. She could say her name and remember it belonged to a woman who rode well, who once split a reed clean with an arrow, who had stood in front of men and refused to be smaller so that they would be taller. She could not walk. She could not bargain with iron. She could not pretend she was not furious at the sky for having no door she could kick. This fury did not make her ugly. It made her alive. She turned her face carefully and let the sun warm one cheek, then the other, as if she were not a wounded thing, but a plant deciding where to grow next. When the heat pressed too much, she breathed through the discomfort like a mother breathes a child through a narrow place. Slow, grounded, fierce. The body listens when it is spoken to plainly. She slept only in pieces, and when she woke, she did so gently, as if not to startle herself. At some point in the long silence between wind and insects and the small drag of grit over stone, a clear thought arrived and sat down beside her. She was not a body abandoned in the desert. She was a woman who had been interrupted. Interruptions do end. She said the word "end" under her breath and felt its taste. Not bitter, not sweet. Clean. On the third morning the air changed before the light did. There is a particular quiet that happens just before heat returns. A hush, like a hand brushed over hair. She felt it. A new dawn had decided to be kind. The skin at the back of her neck cooled for the first time since the blast. Her eyes opened into blue that still remembered darkness. The hawk circled with less insistence. A coyote barked once, and then thought better of it. Her water skin was light now. She measured what remained, and did not lie to herself. She moistened her lips by touching the wetness with a finger and letting it travel, patient as a prayer. She used the rest to dampen the cloth around her thighs. The sting was honest. She preferred honesty to mercy that arrived with a condition hidden in its pocket. The world gave her a gift then. A butterfly, ridiculous and brave, wandered down the ravine, drifted over her shoulder, and landed on a stone near her ear. Its wings quivered as if sharing a secret. She watched it for a while and confessed to it, since it seemed willing, "I am not finished." It took to the air and left, and she decided that counted as an agreement between creatures with no obligations except to continue. She tried to pull herself toward the shadow line. Her arms burned. The ground is heavier than it looks when it has decided not to help you. She clawed at the dirt with her fingers and moved the length of 2 breaths. It felt like miles. Gravel bit the heel of her palm. She set her jaw and pretended the sting was just another bee in the hive of living. At the third drag, she stopped. It was enough. The shadow would find her if she stayed alive long enough to greet it. She talked to the day as if it could take dictation. "You will not forget me." The day, which had heard so much worse from so many mouths, did not argue. She thanked it for that too, because gratitude, she had learned, oils hard machinery. In the heat's climb, she found a pocket of memory that did not scald. She was small again, kneeling at the edge of a seep, watching a thin line of water escape stone as if stone had decided to weep politely. Her grandmother's hand rested on her head. "Everything returns," the old woman had said, "not where we expect, not when we demand, but flesh, water, light, story. They are stubborn with their own kind of love." Saka had not believed in stubborn love then. She believed in speed, in a horse's flank, in the clean math of a thrown spear. Now she believed in all of it, the fast and the slow, the blade and the balm. When she drifted, it was into a dream that behaved itself. She was not falling, she was not running. She was walking in water that reached her hips, cool, strong. The current did not fight her. It carried her like a friend with good timing, and every step she took was promised another. She woke to the sound of wind and the surprise of tears that had nothing to do with fear. Healing, she thought, can be like this, quiet, low, not in a hurry to be noticed, faithful as tide. The sun arced. The shadow found her shoulder and stayed. Relief made space where pain had been sitting with its boots on the table. She closed her eyes and let her breath be a river through her. When she opened them, the world had changed in the smallest and best way. She could smell smoke. Not too close, not too much. Pine. A house, then? A cook fire or a barrel warmed. She did not know whose, only that it meant a door existed somewhere within distance, a place where water lived in a barrel instead of a skin. She said her name louder than she had all day, testing the canyon's echo. Saka. The ravine sent it back, softened but intact. A yes. Hunger arrived in the polite way of an old pain that knows it can wait. She told it to sit. It did. The light began to tilt, the kind of angle that makes even hard land look as if it were forgiving you for past rudeness. Birds spoke at the edges of brush. A beetle crossed her wrist with the determination of a priest. Then, because a story wants its door, a sound came that did not belong to insects or birds or the memory of iron. Hooves. One, not many, measured. The cadence of a horse that had nothing to prove. It did not rush. It did not drag. It did what the day had taught it to do. Move forward, steady as breath. She did not let hope behave like a riot. She held it like a lit match in cupped hands. The hoofbeats reached the edge of the ravine and hesitated. The animal snorted, the sound clean and alive. Something shifted, the small clink of leather, a saddle's answer to a man moving. She pictured a hat brim, pale eyes or dark, a rifle, kindness or indifference. Desert men came in all languages, some as quiet as a noon creek, some as loud as storm. She had met both and survived both. She did a simple thing then that might have saved her life more than once. She steadied her face into a calm that was not lying. She was not a plea. She was not a warning. She was a woman. She turned her head toward the sound and waited. boot heels slid on grit, careful, not clumsy. A shadow interrupted the light. It leaned over the edge, held there, then moved slow down the slope. She caught a glimpse of denim, a worn coat, hands that knew tools. The wind brought a clean smell, soap, wood smoke, sweat, human, ordinary. She could have wept for the ordinariness of it. He stopped within reach and did not reach. This mattered. Men who do not know how to measure their hands do worse things with their mouths. He crouched, and for the first time she saw his eyes. Not the color first, but the way they looked at her without taking anything. A steady blue set in a face Sun had argued with and mostly won. Lines. A scar along the jaw, as if a blade had kissed him once and meant it. He took off his hat, not like a performance, but because shade can be a gift you give with your hands. They did not speak. Names are heavy, you do not throw them at strangers. He looked at the bindings at her thighs, as a man looks at a knot he has to understand to undo. He did not flinch. She watched his mouth, as if it might tell her whether he was the kind who would think she was a debt he did not want to pay. The mouth remained a straight line. His chest rose and fell with patience. He put his hand on the ground where she could see it, the palm calloused, the nails clean enough for a man who worked. "Water," he said finally, and the voice was low, rough from disuse, a riverbed cleared of stones, but not of memory. She nodded once. He lifted the skin from his belt and tipped it to her in a way that let her choose how it would meet her mouth. She took it, the weight of it wrong and wonderful in her hands, and drank the way a person who wants tomorrow drinks, slow, careful, grateful, without greed. Half a swallow, and she stopped. He nodded approval, like a man passing a test he'd hoped you'd learned already. When he reached toward the cloth around her thighs, he did so as if approaching a skittish animal, letting the intention arrive before the touch. His fingers were warm, precise. He did not peel, he did not prod, he did not pry. He cleaned a place with a wetted rag and pressed with the kind of pressure that comforts and cautions at once. She hissed. He paused. She steadied her breath. He continued. Partnership, born wordless. His shadow covered her chest where fabric had torn. He noticed. He turned his head slightly away and made a small adjustment with his free hand, a respectful cover, a simple mercy that required nothing more than seeing. It was then she allowed herself to look at him fully, the set of his shoulders, the weary width of him, the way his right leg favored the left by the smallest degree. Hurt recognizes hurt. She did not decide to trust him. She decided not to refuse the trust that had already begun to happen in her body like a reflex practiced long before it is needed. He did not ask who did this. He did not ask where her people were. He did not ask if she wanted to live. These were questions that wanted to be answered by actions, not by words that leave you tired. He slid one arm beneath her shoulders, another beneath her knees that were no longer there, and drew her up as if his ribcage had been made to learn this exact weight. She felt the strength in him without the boast. She let her head fall against his collarbone because the world tilted and she had to choose a horizon. The horse, grey, steady, with the kind eye of an animal that had learned men both ways, stood just above them, reins loose. The man lifted her, rose in a single careful motion, and set her across the front of the saddle with an efficiency that proved he had carried more than gear in his life. He did not look at her mouth. He did not study the torn line of her dress as if it were an invitation. He checked the knots on the bandage with one last glance, craft, not curiosity, then swung up behind her, his arm a brace that did not claim. When the horse moved, she felt the world return, not as past, but as future. Each step was a promise kept. The trail climbed. Dust offered itself and fell away. The ravine narrowed, then widened, then let them go. She did not look back. What was there would not be improved by her attention. A hawk cried once overhead, less like a judge now, more like a witness. They rode. The man's breath joined hers in the small space where strangers share weather. She learned his rhythm. He learned hers. The land admitted them like a host who does not smile and does not send you away. Above the ridge, the sky had softened. Cloud scraps lingered like bandages not yet cast aside. In the distance, a thin column of smoke told a true story. A roof, a stove, a barrel, a table. He turned the horse toward it without show, as if he had decided that his life today was not what it had been yesterday, and saw no reason to make a speech about it. She let the sway of the animal rock a different kind of pain quiet. She closed her eyes the way a child sleeps in a moving cart, trusting that someone else knows the road. When she opened them, she spoke in a voice that surprised them both. Hoarse, small, full of a stubborn gentleness. Silent man. He did not answer. He did not need to. He adjusted his grip to be kinder to her ribs. The horse flicked an ear and kept walking. Far ahead, the outline of a single-room cabin steadied into its shape. A barn leaned nearby like an old man pleased to be of use. The fence was mended in a way that proved patience. The ground between gate and door was swept, not tidy, but tended. This mattered to her. Care writes itself across dirt long before it writes itself on skin. As they crossed the yard, a breeze found her face and cooled it. She felt herself arriving, not at an end, not at a rescue, but at a beginning with edges strong enough to lean on. The man swung down, slid her into his arms, and carried her over the threshold like a vow no preacher had to bless. Inside smelled of wood and smoke, and the clean metal of water. Light fell along a table worn to softness by work. A cot waited with a blanket folded right. He placed her there as if setting a bowl where the dog could not knock it over, practical, protective, unadorned. He straightened slowly, as if remembering that his body had its own litany of aches. She watched him, measuring the quiet between them and finding it a shape that fit her. At the edge of her sight, a lamp. On the shelf, clean cloths. On the peg, a coat that was not his. Stories lived here, but none were loud. They would tell themselves when time asked. Her breath evened. He stepped to a barrel, dipped a rag, wrung it once, returned. The cloth on her forehead felt like the first kind word in a long season. She did not cry, not because it would have been weakness, but because the body sometimes knows to spend its water on healing, not on salt. He lifted the torn edge of her dress without staring and set to the work nobody mentions when they brag about saving a life. The patient, ordinary tending that smells of sap and soap and humility. When he cleaned a place that had been angry too long, she let out a sound she had not made since childhood. Relief. He heard it and adjusted his hands minutely, the way a musician softens a note for a room. The lamp flame ticked. Outside, wind moved the barn's loosened board and made it speak its usual complaint. He tied a new bandage, checked a knot, and finally, only then, met her eyes again. They held there, steady as two stones in the same stream. Not a promise, not yet. Something simpler, recognition. She said her name quietly, offering it with the respect you give a tool that hasn't failed you. Saka. He nodded once, as if the word had been on his tongue already, and now, at last, had a place to sit. Wade, he said, and the sound of it fit in the room like a beam that had always wanted to be part of this roof. The wind pressed at the shutters and thought better of it. The light changed. The house, which had been waiting for something to do besides keep weather out, seemed to relax its joints. Wade set a tin cup near her hand. Saka breathed. Tomorrow, with its quiet and its labor and its tests, would arrive on its own legs. For now there was a cot, a lamp, a man who did not hurry, a woman who had decided she was not finished. If this beginning softened something inside you, if it felt like shade in a hard noon or a small healing sip of water, I'd be grateful if you tapped like, shared a comment with the moment that held you, and subscribed to stay close as this story unfolds. Your presence turns these quiet pages into companions. Under the relentless sky, the days blurred into one another, but the moment Wade found her changed everything. He had not spoken her name, he did not even know it yet, but the bond between them had already begun to take shape in silence. He carried her through the dust and heat, his arms steady despite the weight of sorrow that clung to both their lives. Inside his cabin, the dim light softened the edges of her pain. The smell of pine sap and smoke wrapped around her like a fragile shield. Every motion he made was unhurried, deliberate, as though he understood that haste might break what little strength she still possessed. His hands, hardened by years of solitude and labor, touched her wounds with unexpected gentleness, and though her eyes betrayed fury at her helplessness, they softened for an instant whenever his shadow moved across her. That night, when the lamp's flame burned low, the air inside carried a kind of healing silence. She drifted between waking and sleep, caught in fever and memory, yet she sensed something steady near her, the rhythm of a man who had chosen not to leave. For Wade, it was not pity, but recognition, a quiet echo of his own brokenness mirrored in hers. The sound of her shallow breathing kept him awake, watching, waiting, guarding. He knew the danger of harboring her, but the thought of abandoning her never once crossed his mind. Morning light slipped across the cabin walls. Saka's gaze followed the beams as if they were pathways back to life. When he brought her broth and bread, she did not reach for it. She only looked at him, her lips cracked, voice rasping like dry earth. Silent man. He paused at the door, the words sinking into him deeper than she knew. He did not answer, but something had been spoken between them that could not be undone. As the hours passed, she tested her strength, shifting her body with trembling arms. Wade remained near, offering no words, only the firm presence of someone who refused to look away. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, a little broken from long disuse. "You'll rip your stitches." She met his eyes, startled by the sound, and for the first time since the blast, she allowed herself to lean on another. He guided her into the chair he had cut and lowered years before, his hand steady against her back, his silence no longer empty but protective, almost tender. The days that followed shaped themselves into a rhythm neither expected. He split wood, mended fences, tended to cattle. She learned how to move again, each painful effort a declaration that she would not surrender to despair. He crafted a small wooden platform with wheels salvaged from a broken cart, his hands working late into the night beneath the glow of an oil lamp. When he placed it before her, she touched its edge without smiling, but her eyes carried something that almost was. "You made this," she whispered. "You didn't beg," he replied. The unspoken truth lingered between them. She was not a burden, and he was not her jailer. They were simply two souls breathing in the same fragile space. She began to whisper his name at night, trying the sound on her tongue as if to make it real. Wade. It was not a plea, not even gratitude, but a mark of recognition. In turn, he watched the firelight play across her face, saw not ruin, but resilience. Her scars were maps of survival, and her fury was proof of life. More than once, she cursed under her breath, forcing her body forward on the small rolling seat, sweat glistening against her temples. He never stopped her. When she collapsed, he lifted her without judgment, setting her gently back on the cot, and left her dignity intact. The fever came as night fell heavy, shrouding her in shadows of delirium. She muttered names from a world he did not know, clawed at the blankets as if trying to escape the fire that burned inside her. Wade stayed, wiping her face with cool cloths, forcing bitter willow bark down her throat, though she fought him weakly. When her hands grasped his arm, desperate and wild, he did not pull away. Her breath came in broken waves, her voice trembling with words he could not understand, but one name repeated itself, Tana. He guessed it was her brother. He did not ask, only sat steady through the hours until the fever broke and her eyes opened, heavy but clear. "You stayed," she whispered. He nodded, nothing more. In that moment, she knew he had given her something beyond medicine, the promise of presence, the healing weight of someone who refused to run. In the quiet days that followed, their silence transformed. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but of people who had begun to share the same air, the same small world. She asked about the land, the cabin, the cattle that grazed beyond the hills. He answered simply, fragments of a life stitched together by grief and endurance. She noticed the coat hanging by the door, too fine to be his. A woman's coat, carefully cleaned though never worn. She asked nothing, but in her heart she understood. He too had ghosts. The bond between them grew in the spaces where words were scarce. She felt it when he set food near her hand without waiting for thanks. He felt it when she muttered his name in the dark, no longer calling him Silent Man, but simply Wade. One evening, when her dress tore further from the strain of movement, leaving her shoulders bare beneath the dim lamplight, she met his eyes with defiance. "Doesn't bother you?" she asked. His gaze did not shift. "You're a woman," he said, simple and true. Her voice trembled with bitterness. "A broken one." He did not flinch. No, just that. That night, she did not pull the blanket so high. That night, she did not turn away when he lifted her into the cot. And that night, though neither spoke, the silence between them deepened into something warmer, something that held the faint, healing pulse of hope. The world outside their walls remained harsh, the desert unforgiving, the echoes of war still near. Yet within that cabin a fragile peace grew. and she found herself breathing differently, less as someone abandoned, more as someone found. He discovered that the weight of loneliness he had carried for years was slowly lifting, replaced by the simple rhythm of caring for another. Beyond the dry ridges, danger lingered, but inside, the beginnings of love stirred quietly, like embers under ash. And though neither dared name it yet, they both knew the truth. Neither of them would ever be alone again. And just as this story continues to unfold with layers of love, resilience, and quiet healing, let your heart stay close to it. If these words touch something inside you, if they remind you of hope rising from despair, then I invite you to share your thoughts below, leave a gentle comment, and let your presence be part of this journey. And if you wish to keep walking with me through stories of love that heal and transform, let your heart guide you to like and subscribe so that together we can continue to breathe life into tales that bring warmth and peace to the soul. The morning broke with a softer light, spilling through the cracks of the wooden shutters and falling across the narrow cot where she rested. Saka stirred, her body still weak, but steadier than the days before, her breaths no longer caught between fever and despair. She sat up slowly, gripping the edge of the blanket that covered her legs, or what remained of them, her hands trembling only slightly as she pulled the cloth tight. The world outside the window whispered with wind across the dry earth. Yet, inside, there was something almost healing, a fragile peace, born not from comfort, but from survival. Wade entered without ceremony, carrying water in a dented tin cup, the lines of his face drawn yet softened by the morning glow. He set it near her and stepped back, watching her eyes lift to meet his. No words passed between them at first, but the silence had changed, less heavy, more like a bridge that could be crossed. She reached for the cup, her fingers brushing his hand, and in that brief touch lay a spark of understanding. She drank, slow and careful, then handed it back without thanks. She didn't need to. He already knew. When he moved toward the stove, she studied the way his shoulders carried both strength and weariness. She noticed his limp, the subtle drag of his right leg, the way he shifted his weight to mask the pain. He was no stranger to wounds. Perhaps that was why he could look at her without pity. He cooked in silence, the sound of the fire snapping filling the room, while she adjusted herself against the wall, testing the strength in her arms as she pulled her body upright. Her jaw tightened with effort, her breath quickened, yet she did not give in to weakness. Wade turned once, caught her struggling, and without hesitation crossed the room. He crouched beside her, his voice low, rough from long silence. "You'll tear your stitches." She froze, startled more by the sound of his words than their meaning. For a moment her eyes softened, and she allowed him to steady her back, his hand firm but gentle. That small exchange shifted something between them. She no longer saw him as a stranger hovering on the edge of her survival, but as a man willing to share the burden of her pain. When he left her side, she remained upright, her body trembling but her spirit unwilling to bow. Her gaze followed him as he returned to the stove, her heart unsure why his silence now felt like shelter instead of distance. Later, when the light outside grew brighter, Wade brought her a bowl of stew. This time she accepted, lifting the spoon with slow, shaking hands, eating in small bites while he tended to the fire. He did not watch her, but he stayed close, as though his presence alone could guard against the shadows pressing at the edges of her world. For the first time, She felt the faint warmth of belonging in a place she had never known before. Days turned into a rhythm. Each morning Wade worked the land, splitting wood, repairing fences, tending to cattle, while she remained inside, teaching herself how to move again. The rolling platform he built became her vessel of freedom. At first she cursed it, fumbling, her hands blistering as she dragged herself across the floor, sweat dripping from her temples. Yet each failure was a step forward, each fall a lesson. Wade never mocked, never pitied. When she collapsed, he lifted her quietly, his hands steady, his silence stronger than words of comfort could ever be. In those moments, she began to see him differently, not as the man who found her, but as the man who stayed. She whispered his name in the quiet hours, Wade. It tasted strange, unfamiliar, yet grounding. He was no longer only the silent man, but the one tethering her back to life. One evening, when the fire painted the walls in flickering gold, she caught his gaze lingering on the scars of her legs as he rewrapped the cloth around them. She bristled, her voice sharp despite its rasp. "Doesn't bother you?" His eyes lifted, calm, unwavering. "You're a woman." She let out a bitter laugh, hollow as wind across stone. A broken one. His voice remained steady. "No, just that." The simplicity of his words pierced deeper than any tenderness could. That night, she did not hide her body beneath the blanket as she once had. When he carried her back to the cot, her eyes met his without flinching, and though neither spoke, something shifted. The silence between them no longer fragile, but filled with a quiet promise. As days unfolded, she found herself noticing the small gestures that spoke louder than words, the way he left a shirt folded at the foot of her bed when her dress could no longer be patched, the way he set food within her reach, but never pressed her to eat, the way his gaze softened when she muttered his name. Each act, though simple, carried the weight of healing. Her body grew stronger. The blisters on her palms hardened into calluses, and she no longer winced each time she pushed herself across the floor. She began to find pride in her movements, however slow, each inch a defiance of despair. Wade, watching from the corner, said nothing, but his eyes betrayed a quiet respect. She no longer felt abandoned. She was not forgotten. She was alive, and someone saw her. The fever returned once more, fierce and unrelenting, dragging her back to the edge of shadows. She thrashed, muttering in her native tongue, her voice breaking with names of those she had lost. Wade stayed through it all, cooling her skin with wet cloths, holding her shoulders when the fire inside threatened to consume her. When she clawed at him in delirium, he held firm, unshaken. Through the long night he stayed, and when the fever broke, she woke to find his eyes weary but present, his body slumped from exhaustion, but still near. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound. His nod was quiet, but it carried the weight of something unspoken yet undeniable. From then on, she no longer doubted. She no longer feared the silence, for she had come to understand that within it lived loyalty, presence, and a kind of love too deep for words. Wade did not rescue her because she was weak. He chose her because she was alive, and in that choice she found strength enough to keep breathing. Outside, the desert winds carried whispers of danger, but within the walls of the cabin something healing grew. Their lives had become entwined, not through promises or vows, but through the steady rhythm of survival shared. She no longer felt like a shadow left to fade beneath the unforgiving sun. She was becoming something more. A woman not broken but reborn, her heart slowly weaving itself into his, thread by thread, silence by silence. And as the fire burned low that evening, she looked across the room at the man who had become her anchor. He sat quietly, carving wood in his hands, his profile traced by lamplight. She whispered his name once more, softer this time, not as a question, but as a truth. Wade. The desert outside stretched endlessly, harsh and unforgiving, yet here within these walls the first seeds of love had been sown. And as the night deepened, neither of them needed to speak it aloud. They both knew they would never again be alone. The days stretched longer as spring deepened, the desert heat wrapping itself around the cabin like an uninvited guest that refused to leave. Inside, however, the air felt different, softened by the quiet rhythm of two lives learning to move in step. Saka had begun to master the wooden platform Wade built for her. Each morning, she rolled across the rough floorboards with stronger arms, her palms hardened into calluses that no longer stung. Where once she cursed under her breath, now she breathed with more patience, allowing herself to notice the small victories, reaching the table without help, bracing against the doorframe without slipping, lifting the kettle without dropping it. Each success stitched a new piece of her spirit back together. Wade watched her progress without fanfare. He never clapped or praised, never used words that might strip her of dignity. Instead, he adjusted the wheels when they squeaked, reinforced the rails when they loosened, and made small changes she never asked for, but always needed. When she burned her hand once lifting the iron pot, he replaced the handle with a cloth wrap. When her blanket slipped often from her lap, he left a leather strap folded on the table, silent but thoughtful. She took these things without thanks, but in her eyes something gentler had begun to form, like water smoothing the edges of stone. Their meals shifted too. At first, Wade ate alone at the table while she balanced herself against the wall. But one evening, he brought a second chair and set it beside her rolling seat. He said nothing, only placed a bowl before her and sat down across the lamp's soft glow. For the first time, they ate together. The silence filled not with distance, but with something close to peace. She watched the firelight catch in his pale blue eyes, saw the faint scar along his jaw, the way his rough hands moved with surprising care as he cut bread. "You always this quiet?" she asked, her voice low but steady. He looked at her, just for a second, and the faintest smile touched his mouth. "Talk when I need to," he said. That was enough. Later, she asked him to bring her outside. He hesitated, his gaze sharp, protective. "Don't want folks seeing," he muttered. But she shook her head. "There's no one out there. I need the wind." He carried her to the porch, setting her gently on a padded bench, and together they sat beneath a sky streaked with orange and purple. She closed her eyes, breathing slow, feeling the desert air brush across her face like a healing hand. For the first time since the blast, she felt alive in the open. Wade sat beside her, his hat resting on his lap. When her shoulder brushed against his, she didn't pull away. The silence between them grew heavier, not with distance, but with closeness neither dared name. She turned toward him, eyes searching, her voice quiet. You ever touch a woman like this? Not out of pity, not out of duty, just because—" He met her gaze, steady as stone. "I don't see you as broken," he said. Her hand moved, slow and deliberate, sliding across the bench until it found his. She guided his palm to her hip, to the curve of what remained, scarred but still hers. "I can't feel it the same," she whispered, "but I still want it." The world seemed to still in that moment. He did not pull away. He let his fingers stay where she placed them, his breath deepening as he watched her eyes soften. She leaned closer, lips brushing his cheek before finding his mouth. The kiss was slow, healing, filled with a hunger not for passion, but for connection. He kissed her back, his hand steady on her waist, his silence answering everything her heart feared to ask. When he lifted her and carried her inside, laying her gently on the cot, there was no hesitation. She opened the shirt he had given her, her body thin, scarred, yet alive with a new fire. He undressed without shame, his chest marked with its own stories, his scars meeting hers like an old truth. That night, they did not rush. Every movement was deliberate, careful, tender. She touched the scar along his hip, whispering, "You're not the only one with ghosts." He pressed his lips against the scar of her thigh, answering without words. When they came together, it was not desperation, but healing. Two broken bodies finding wholeness in each other's arms. When it was done, he did not move away. He stayed beside her, her head resting against his chest, her fingers tracing the lines of his skin as though memorizing every inch. "You could have left me," she whispered. His voice was quiet, but firm. "But I didn't." And that was all she needed. Morning found them changed. Wade rose first, as always, but when he looked back at her sleeping form, a new weight filled his chest. Not sorrow, not regret, but something full, something alive. He stepped outside, the frost still clinging to the troughs, yet his thoughts remained inside, on the way her hand had rested against his chest through the night. When she woke, she too felt the change. Her body still ached, phantom pains still whispered through her legs, but she no longer felt hollow. She rolled to the table, boiled water, and when Wade returned, she handed him a cup of coffee without a word. It was the first time she had prepared something for him, and though she did not smile, her eyes carried quiet warmth. Days passed, and their closeness grew. She began asking about his past, about the battles he fought, about the wife whose coat still hung by the door. His answers came slowly, in fragments, each one a piece of a man who had lost more than he cared to admit. She did not press, only listened, offering silence in return. When she spoke of her brother, the one who cut her legs to save her, the one who left her behind, her voice cracked with both fury and love. Wade reached across the table, taking her hand without asking, and she let him. The nights deepened with tenderness. Sometimes they lay together without words, her head against his chest, his hand over her heart, the sound of the wind outside weaving with the rhythm of their breaths. Other nights they made love again, slower, surer, not to erase their pain, but to claim something beyond it. Each touch reminded her that she was not broken, that she was still a woman, wanted, desired. Each kiss reminded him that he was not alone, that life had given him another chance to love. By early June, she no longer asked what came next. She no longer feared the silence or the shadows of her past. She began stitching torn cloth into a blanket, carving small beads of bone to thread onto her necklace, acts of creation where once there had been only survival. Wade built a ramp at the back porch, hammering boards until she could roll outside on her own. When she tried it, straining against the slope, she laughed softly for the first time, a sound like water breaking through dry earth. Wade, standing nearby, let himself smile. Their days became a tapestry of quiet gestures, his hand adjusting her blanket, her fingers brushing dust from his shoulder, meals shared by lamplight, stories whispered into the fire. They did not speak of love, but it was there, pulsing steady beneath every silence, every touch, every breath. And as the desert stretched wide and merciless beyond the walls, within the cabin a different kind of life took root. Not the frantic grasp of survival, but the slow, healing birth of something new. Together they carried their ghosts, together they bore their scars, and together they began to build a future neither had dared imagine. The summer sun scorched the valley until the earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of heat. Days bled into one another, yet within the cabin walls life pulsed with a quiet steadiness. Saka had grown strong in her arms, her back straighter, her movements more deliberate. She no longer trembled when rolling across the floor. Her body had adapted, and her spirit had learned to rise above the emptiness her legs had left behind. Each morning she wrapped herself in the shirt Wade had given her, cinched it with a strip of leather, and carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had refused to die. Wade noticed everything, every improvement, every flicker of determination in her eyes. He did not speak of it, but his silence carried the weight of admiration. He built small things for her without explanation, a shelf within easy reach, a hook for her blanket, a handle fixed near the stove so she could steady herself when she reached for the kettle. These were not gifts, not pity, but extensions of his presence in her life, wordless affirmations that he saw her not as broken but as whole. The evenings became their sanctuary. After long hours of work outside, Wade returned with dust on his shoulders and sweat at his brow. Saka waited near the table, sometimes preparing bread or beans with her own hands, her movements slow but deliberate. They ate together by the soft glow of the lamp, speaking little, yet each silence was threaded with warmth. She found herself watching the curve of his jaw, the way his eyes softened in firelight, the roughness of his hands that became gentle whenever they touched her. He found himself listening to the cadence of her breath, the way her presence filled spaces that had once been haunted only by loneliness. One night, when the desert wind rose sharp and restless, she rolled closer to where he sat, whittling by the fire. Without asking, she reached for his hand, laying it over her chest, where her heart beat steady. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. He nodded, his thumb brushing against her collarbone. "It's still strong," she said, her voice low, healing in its quiet conviction. He did not answer, but his eyes told her he believed it. That night she leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder until sleep claimed her, the fire still crackling low beside them. But peace in the desert was fragile. One afternoon, as Wade repaired the back gate, Saka's sharp eyes caught movement along the ridge. A rider approached slowly, dust trailing behind like a warning. She wheeled herself closer to the porch, her hand tightening around the knife Wade had given her. The man who dismounted was lean, his coat worn, his eyes sharp with suspicion. He spoke of rumors, of a wounded Apache woman who had survived a blast near Copper Ridge. His voice carried the weight of trouble, and his smile never reached his eyes. Saka held herself still, face unreadable, while Wade stepped from behind the barn, rifle in hand. The stranger weighed his chances, but Wade's steady silence left little room for doubt. The man left without bloodshed, yet the dust of his departure carried unease. Saka exhaled slowly, releasing the knife from her grip, and whispered, "They know." Wade's gaze remained fixed on the trail. They always did. Now they care. That night, beneath the weight of uncertainty, he pulled up the trap-door hidden beneath the floor, revealing the space he had built for her during her fever. She looked at him long, her eyes soft yet fierce. When she kissed him, it was not out of fear, but out of a vow unspoken. She would not be taken from this place without a fight. The days that followed were taut with waiting. Every sound outside, the cry of a hawk, the creak of the barn, seemed sharper, heavier. Wade kept his rifle close. Saka sharpened the blade of her knife, weaving a leather sling to tie it against her chest. They spoke little of the danger, but their hands found each other more often, lingering longer, holding tighter. In the quiet of the nights, she pressed against him, whispering not of fear, but of belonging. "You're my husband or not?" she asked once, her eyes locked to his. He gave no answer in words, only pulled her close, his silence becoming the truest vow. When soldiers finally came, their boots heavy, their voices clipped, Wade stood at the doorway with his rifle low but ready. Saka lay beneath the floorboards, her breath shallow, her hand clutching the knife in the dark. The men searched, their eyes sweeping corners, their hands brushing against shelves, but they never lifted the rug. Wade's voice remained calm, unflinching, and when the soldiers left, she emerged covered in sweat and dust, her arms trembling. He pulled her into his chest, and for a long moment she clung to him, whispering, "I'm tired of being hunted." His reply was steady, "You're not alone. We'll be ready." That night she cut the hem of one of his shirts, stitching it into a sash across her chest. On it she embroidered one word in dark thread, "Still." She wore it not as decoration, but as armor, a claim over her body and her life. When she showed him, his hand brushed the fabric softly, his eyes filled with quiet pride. They made love again, not out of fear or urgency, but out of choice, their bodies speaking truths words could not hold. He whispered, "You're mine now," and she answered without shame, "I've been yours since you carried me from the dirt." The days that followed carried both vigilance and tenderness. Wade reinforced the barn walls, stocked supplies, counted ammunition. Saka practiced with the knife, her arms steady, her movements precise. Yet amidst the tension, there was healing too. She sat outside beneath the cottonwood, stitching beads from bone, her necklace growing heavier with each one. He joined her sometimes, his hand resting on hers, the silence between them alive with unspoken promises. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she took a small carved ring from a pouch at her side. Its edges were rough, uneven, yet strong. She held it out to him. "You took me in when I had nothing left. That's more than most men would do for a wife." Wade stared at the ring for a long moment before sliding it onto his finger. "Then I guess I'm her husband now." Her eyes softened, her voice steady. "You always were." That night, Laughter filled the cabin for the first time. She burned the cornbread she had tried to make, cursed in Apache, and nearly tossed the pan into the fire. Wade ate every bite without complaint, declaring it the best bread he had ever tasted. She saw through his lie, but smiled anyway, the sound of her laughter carrying like music into the desert night. And when they lay together afterward, tangled in blankets, her head on his chest, the weight of the world outside seemed to vanish. "Do you miss the old life?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "Only things I never had." She lifted her gaze, her eyes deep and certain. "Like this." He met her stare without flinching. "Like this." The desert remained harsh. Danger still lingered beyond the horizon. But inside that cabin, love had taken root, steady, fierce, and healing. Two souls once shattered had begun to weave themselves into something whole, something unbreakable. And as the night deepened, their silence spoke louder than any vow, carrying them into the next dawn with the quiet promise that no matter what came, they would face it together. The creek ran thin that season, a silver thread over stone, and the cottonwood leaves along its bank trembled whenever the lightest wind tested them. Wade had started hitching the wagon there on Sundays, if only because the quiet hollowed a space where both of them could breathe. Saka liked the sound of water, how it spoke without interrupting, how it promised that even in a summer that burned the mouth of the land, something could still move, still cool, still live. He would lift her down with the care he'd use for a blade that mattered, and she would settle against the trunk while he spread a blanket in the grass. The first time they came, she pressed her palm to the bark and said it felt like resting her hand against the ribs of a patient animal. After that, the cottonwood was simply theirs. The days around those Sundays gathered a steadier rhythm. In the mornings, she rolled out to the porch alone now, elbows strong, shoulders no longer trembling when she eased over thresholds. He had sanded the door lips smooth for her, just enough to keep the cabin snug, not enough to bark her wrists when she pushed. Tiny changes, honest as breath. She started carving small figures from bone at the table. A hawk, a coiled snake, the blunt muzzle of a horse, each one more sure in the hand than the last. When he repaired a broken gate or split cedar, she watched how he measured without ever using a rule, how his fingers knew where the grain would fight back, and she thought that love might just be learning the weight and weather of another person's days. Wade kept his rifle oiled and close, but he did not let it become a shadow at their table. He had learned the habit of readiness in a life that had taken what it wanted, and still he found a way to set the weapon aside whenever she caught his eye. She asked him once what he'd do if the past came riding over their fence line on a horse with a federal saddle. He looked out toward the North Ridge a long time, jaw flexing, the old scar at his jawline whitening as it pulled. "Same thing we did last time," he said finally. "Keep you here." It should have settled her, that answer. It did, and it did not. She wore the sash she'd stitched across her heart, the one word in black thread anchoring every movement she made. Still, she said it to herself some mornings like a prayer, sometimes like a promise, sometimes like a dare. When the heat raised blisters where skin met wood and she had to stop, she traced the letters through the fabric with her thumb until her breath smoothed again. When the kettle grew too heavy and her hands shook, she set it down, laughed softly at her stubbornness, and reached for a cloth. Wade had wrapped the handles without saying a word. She kissed his shoulder. For that, just once in passing, and he stood there long after she rolled away, staring at the place where her mouth had been, like it was a mark he didn't want to fade. They began to speak more, not in the way of people who need to fill empty air, but in the way of those who know they can set their stories down and none will be kicked aside. She told him about the long years before the blast, about learning to ride not for war but for weather, so she could outrun a storm to find the children before the skies swallowed the flats. She told him she hunted because meat meant life, not because she liked the kill, and he heard the clean mercy in that. He told her about Missouri fields in spring, about a mother who sang soft while sorting seed, and a father whose laugh was a door that opened a room you didn't want to leave. He told her about the fire, too, slowly, not all at once, and she memorized where his voice thinned and where it returned, so she would not tread on the fragile pieces with careless questions. Sometimes at night, when air cooled enough for skin to rest, they lay across the cot and said nothing at all. Those were the hours Saka learned the map of him by touch, the thick rope of muscle at his forearm, the hollow above his collarbone where her fingers liked to settle, the quiet thrum of his pulse just below his ear. He traced the edges of her scars with the same care, not to mourn what flesh had lost, but to praise what flesh had refused to surrender. "Still," he would say sometimes, so softly she felt it more than heard it, and she would answer by lifting his hand to her heart, letting him feel what had not given up its beat. On a morning when the air smelled faintly of ash from a brush pile a neighbor burned miles away, she saw dust moving in a way that meant more than wind. She had learned to read distance by the shape of what rose. Wind was a smear, riders were needles. These were needles, 2, maybe 3. She called to Wade without raising fear in her voice, and he stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands. He looked, nodded once, and said her name the way a man says the word that pulls him back to center. They did not hurry. They did not scatter. He checked the trap-door, smoothed the rug, and then looked at her. She shook her head. "Not today," she said. "Not because I'm afraid." His eyes held hers long enough to answer. He set the rifle on its pegs and took down the shotgun instead, the kind of choice you make when you intend to end a conversation quickly if it tries to grow teeth. He leaned it just inside the door and washed his hands at the basin. The small dignity of that gesture steadied her more than any weapon could have. 3 men rode in, none wearing a uniform proper, but 2 with the stiff suspicion of men who liked to pretend they wore one. The 3rd moved like he'd slept in saddles since boyhood. Their horses blew, glad for shade. The men didn't dismount. Wade stepped onto the porch, posture loose, weight tipped off the bad hip so subtly Saka knew no stranger would see it. She rolled out only as far as the doorway, the shadow of the beam cutting her in half. The one in front tipped his hat like a man who wants a favor but has never had to ask for one. He said the word "Marshal," as if it ought to part the air ahead of him. "We're following a description," he said, producing paper he didn't hand over. "Woman, Apache, wounded, taken unlawfully from federal custody." Saka felt the memory of the ravine then, not like a blade, more like the flash of heat when you open an oven door and it reminds you what fire can do. She kept her mouth shut. Wade's face stayed empty as uncut wood. "No one here like that," he said. "You can look from the fence." They did not like that, not one bit. They peered anyway, squinting as if they could force truth into their eyes if they tried hard enough. The youngest looked at Saka, the line of her shoulders, the corded strength of her arms, the way she didn't flinch from being seen. And he shifted in his saddle because instinct told him something his orders did not. The paperman cleared his throat. "We'll be back," he said, not as a promise, but as a habit. "Bring a warrant," Wade replied. He said it easily, almost kindly, as if he were offering the right tool to a man who'd chosen the wrong one. They turned their horses with more dust than grace, and for a long time after the sound of hooves smoothed into distance, neither Wade nor Saka moved. She could hear his breath. She could feel her own. In the tightness between those rhythms, a question rose. How many times could they refuse the past entry before it found a way in through the walls of a life built new? When he turned, he gave her the answer he had. "We'll add boards to the barn door," he said, "and I'll grease the hinges. If they come back, they won't hear us breathing." "So we don't run," she said. "So we live," he corrected, and the slight smile at his mouth's corner made the word land softer than defiance, steadier than rage. They worked. Work was prayer. He planed planks. She sanded the edges by hand, feeling each roughness give way under the quiet insistence of persistence. He taught her to break down the shotgun and oil it without rushing. She taught him to listen for the way the air changed when a rider crested a far ridge, how the sound arrived before the shape. At dusk, they brought the wagon into the barn and filled its bed with sacks of grain that could serve as cover if cover ever needed to be made. He moved lamp oil and flour and water to the cellar, checking the ladder rungs with a boot heel, not because he doubted them, but because it was a mercy not to doubt something that had to hold. The next rider came alone, from the east, at a trot that never once faltered. It wasn't Harlan. This man rode like the horse was an extension of his body. He wore his hair in 2 braids, a faded blue neckerchief knotted without show. He didn't reach for a weapon when he saw Saka. He slid off the saddle and walked the last yards, leading his horse by the rein, as if introducing an old friend to another. Wade stood with his hand a comfortable distance from the shotgun, not touching it, only knowing it was there. The man's eyes found hers, and Saka felt her heart lurch the way a river does when it strikes a hidden boulder. He had the face of her childhood, but carved by distances she did not know, and the scar like a crescent at his left temple meant a memory that would not move aside. He said her name softly, not as a question. "Saka." "Tana," she answered, and the sound of it was a small animal set down and finally allowed to breathe. Wade stepped back, not because he meant to leave, only because he understood this meeting required air. Tana's gaze flicked to the platform beneath his sister, to the rolled strength in her shoulders, to the shirt belted tight at her waist like a second skin. He did not look away from the truth of what had been taken. He did not apologize yet. He did not excuse. He set his palm over his own chest, as if making room for words. "We ran," he said. "Soldiers at our back, He broke off, swallowed, found his breath again. The next words were careful, calloused by use. "I cut to keep you with breath. I went to find wood. We meant to carry you. We did. We had no time. I came back and you were gone, and the ground was torn where they took the bodies who had stopped breathing. I thought you were among those." He lifted his eyes, and did not blink. I have been walking since to find where the grief cut wrong. Saka's hands had not known where to be until he spoke. Now they knew, flat to the sturdy wood of the platform Wade had built, grounding her in the present. The old hurt did not rise like a flood. It rose like a tide that had learned restraint. "You left me a skin of water," she said, "and straps." "Everything we had," he answered, the shame in his voice not simpering, not dramatic, simply there. Wade watched their faces. He had known, since she first spoke the brother's name in fever, that this moment was a hinge. He had also known that love is sometimes the steady hand that holds a door, not the body that fills its frame. "You hungry?" he asked Tana, because ordinary kindness can keep people from turning into the worst version of themselves. Tana's mouth tipped in a small smile of respect. "Yes," he said, "I am." They ate at the table, 3 bowls, 1 lamp, quiet shared in a way that made quiet feel like company, and not lack. Saka told her brother what Wade was by telling what he had done, how he had carried her from filth into a room with light, how he had kept vigil when fever asked for fear, how he had set tools near her hands instead of pity near her heart. Tana listened without cutting in, palms open on the table, a soldier 1,000 miles from any army. When he finally spoke, he spoke to Wade. "I took her legs so breath could stay. You gave her back her path." Wade let the words sit. He had never been a man who knew what to do with praise. Saka learned another piece of him then, how he turned his face just slightly whenever gratitude entered the room, as if even that deserved privacy. "She built her path," he said. "I just scraped the floor." Tana returned the next morning with news that did not feel like a storm at first, and then did. The papermen were moving west with a fresh taste for bounty, their talk sharper, their leave thinner. "They call it order," he said. "It is hunger. I would take you farther into the hills." He meant Saka, and he meant Wade too, though he did not say the second name, because a man does not always speak a promise when he knows he will keep it anyway. Saka shook her head once. "This is my ground," she said. "They already took enough." Tana's glance moved slowly to Wade, asking the only question that mattered. Would the man who had found her bleed beside her when belief turned practical? Wade's nod was small, but it contained everything. "We'll need to show them a different sort of paper," he said, the hint of wry at his mouth, not humour so much as stubborn hope. "Fences, doors that don't open, a neighbour who rides by at the right hour and says he's seen no one." "I can be that," Tana said. They made a plan that looked like a rancher's routine to anyone who hadn't learned to read what people do with their hands. Tana would move cattle along the East Ridge some afternoons and wave at the road like he never had a reason to care what passed. Wade would ride into Copper Ridge for nails and lamp chimneys and ask after the marshal as if such men were part of weather. Saka would sit in the yard, sewing or carving or feeding chickens, and if eyes slid past the absence beneath her blanket, they would slide past a woman at work, which is the most ordinary kind of miracle the world has. But plans are threads, and threads catch. The third day after Tana returned, Harlan rode in with 2 men who wore their hats as if hats made them taller. Their mouths were tight with false law. They had a paper this time with a real stamp, and a name that did not know how to bless anyone. Saka, one read, but he said it wrong, splitting the syllables like a man who has never had to learn another's tongue. Absconded. "I didn't go anywhere," she said, rolling to the porch rail and folding her hands like a woman who owns the ground under her palms. I stayed where life was. Wade stood in the doorway. The shotgun leaned where he could take it up without looking and find it where his hands had already taught his hands it would be. Tana's shadow slid along the barn, a presence like a promise. The leader dismounted, the kind of man who liked the sound Spurs made when there wasn't any music. "You'll come," he said, "not because the law is always right, but because he believed it belonged to him." "No," Wade answered. "There are standoffs that roar." This one was quiet as a pulled breath. Harlan's eyes narrowed, remembering the last time and the way Wade had said, "You won't get the gun halfway out," with the confidence of a man who had never bragged. "A warrant means we search," the paperman said, a little less sure now that the room contained something steadier than fear. "It means you show me it's a home," Wade said, "which you can see from here." He made a small gesture that somehow included the split wood stacked precise, the chickens that minded their own scratch, the lines of care in the rails of Saka's platform where oil made movement smooth. Harlan's gaze hooked on Saka's face and found only a woman looking back. He glanced at her hands and found they did not shake. He looked past Wade and saw no shadows that suggested a trap. When a hawk's cry broke the air above them, everyone's eyes flicked up for that single heartbeat. It is odd how often grace arrives as distraction. When eyes fell back, Tana had stepped far enough out that everyone understood 3 against 2 had turned into a balance different than simple counting. "Leave," Tana said. He did not shout. He offered the men a courtesy a man gives to others whose imaginations have not yet figured out how they might lose. The youngest one's fingers brushed his holster, habit, not decision, and Wade's right foot slid the smallest measure it needed for the ground to remember his weight. Saka did not move, but something in her gaze shifted, and for a bare second even Harlan understood he had walked onto a porch that would never belong to him. Maybe the hawk's shadow helped. Maybe the wind spoke a sentence only a certain kind of man can hear when pride has not yet gone deaf. Harlan lifted his chin. "We'll be back," he said again. But even he knew he had little to return with. "Bring bread," Saka answered, and the corner of Wade's mouth tipped just enough to soften the edge of a day that might have cut. They left. The hush that followed was not relief so much as gratitude's quieter cousin. That evening, Tana sat with his back against the barn and sang a low, old song while Saka trimmed a bone bead into the shape of a crescent. She tied it onto the leather at Wade's wrist, where his pulse would press it with every beat. "What's it mean?" he asked. "Return," she said, and Tana's song slid into a deeper register as if he had heard a meaning layered on top of the first. The next morning, Wade showed Saka a thing he had not built yet, but had been building in his mind. 2 lengths of wood, curved, a sketch of straps. "I don't know if it will work," he said. "It might hurt or give less than I hope." She touched the curve and felt possibility in it like a muscle waking. "We try when you're ready," he added, and what she heard was, "Your body's pace is the calendar we follow." They tried on a day when the cottonwood's leaves barely whispered. The braces were crude, and the leather he had cut bit where he hadn't guessed at the angle right, and the pain made her jaw set so hard his name came out like a stone. They failed twice. She refused to be carried back to the cot when her breath hitched. She rested, then tried again. On the third attempt, with Tana's hand ready but not touching, and Wade's palm hovering an inch from her spine, as if his steadiness could pass skin into bone, she raised herself from the platform, planted what was left of her body where body still answered, and stood. It lasted a moment. It lasted a mountain. She laughed once, an astonished burst, and the sound seemed to shake dust from beams. Wade's eyes shone in a way that had nothing to do with tears and everything to do with a man watching a door open in a wall he'd believed was load-bearing. Tana's breath left his chest in a soft beat of awe. Sakar closed her eyes, felt the weight in her shoulders, and the pull in her stomach, and the press on her skin where the leather insisted, and said quietly, fiercely, a word that was both prayer and law: still. They did not make more out of it than it was. They were careful not to turn a step into a miracle so large it crushed what came next. They unbuckled the straps and set them aside. Wade massaged the place where skin had flushed angry red, his hands firm enough to help, gentle enough to keep her from feeling she was being repaired. Tana fetched water. The day went on, but everything had tilted, and all of them could feel the angle. In the week that followed, the men did not return, though the ridges sometimes teased dust into shapes that made Sakar's ribs brace without needing to. She practiced the brace on mornings when the light was kind. Some days she stood a breath longer. On others, she did not try. Wade learned to read which day was which by the way she tied her hair. Back and high meant iron. A strip loose at her cheek meant she would be softer with herself. He loved her both ways, and he told her so without saying those exact words, because sometimes love is the way a man places a chair, so the sun will warm a woman's shoulder while she works. On a Sunday, they went to the creek again. Wade lifted her down as always, but she surprised him by asking him to set her closer to the water, just where the mud began to be mud and not earth. "It doesn't scare me," she said, seeing his thought before he voiced it. "I want to feel the cool." He set her there, and she reached down and cupped water to her face. It ran over her cheeks and into the hollow of her throat and pooled at the notch of her collarbone, and he swore he could see the heat of the summer lift off her like steam. "I used to watch frogs with someone," he said, because being near water woke the girl who had been his daughter as surely as a scent calls a memory to heal. "Mera," Sakar answered, and when he looked at her, he saw that the name felt safe in her mouth. "She would have come toward you," he said, "because you can sit still and make the world comfortable." Sakar laughed softly. "I would have been loud first," she admitted, "but if she watched long enough, I would have learned quiet from her." They did not need frogs to complete a moment. They had each other, and the sound of water and a cottonwood that had decided to be theirs. Wade reached into his pocket and brought out the ring she had carved, turning it so the grain of bone caught light like a calm eye. "You said husband," he murmured. "I didn't correct you," she said. "I don't intend to." He slid the ring off, then on again, as if to prove to himself it hadn't grown into him yet, and also that it had. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that until the light began to thin. When they turned homeward, Tana was waiting at the fence line with news in his posture before his mouth carried it. He had spoken to a woman who kept notes for the marshal and used those notes to keep the marshal from losing his mind with too much paper. "She says they have other fires now," he told them. Men who pretend at law are always called where there is more shouting. We are less interesting than we were. Saka did not celebrate that like a reprieve from a hangman. She looked at her brother and then at Wade. Less interesting was what they wanted the world to think of them. It meant meals could be made and blankets patched and ramps planed and a life lived in the small absolutes that turn into something you could die satisfied to have chosen. That evening, after Tana rode out to a bedroll he kept under a juniper north of the ridge, after chickens settled and lamp wicks were trimmed, after the rifle was propped in its place and a shirt was folded at the cot's foot, Saka rolled her platform to the doorway. The sky had turned the color of a bruise that doesn't hurt anymore. Wade came to stand beside her, the two of them framed by the threshold like people in a picture taken to prove they had once been this young, this whole, this stubbornly alive. "Do you ever think about the word for what we are?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, and she liked him for that. When he spoke, he kept it simple. "Home," he said. She let the word settle into her bones, the way she had learned to let medicine find the fever in a body. Then she nodded and reached for his hand. He took it, and the weight of it was as familiar now as the steady hush of night when wind leaves the world alone. Inside, on the table, lay the leather and the wood of the braces that would take her farther than any paper ever could. Outside, crickets began their saw-toothed choir. Between those two soundings of life, something opened wider than both of them could see. The next stretch of road that love would ask them to walk, and a door they would have to hold closed together if old storms returned. The lamp gave a small sigh as Wade lowered the flame. The cottonwood whispered without needing to say what it knew. In the hush that followed, their breaths braided again, hers and his, and the house listened, grateful, as if it had been built only for this. Two people steadying each other without apology, ready for whatever might step out of the dark and ask who lived here. And as night drew its cooler hand across the valley, Saka and Wade felt not the edge of fear, but the soft insistence of a future they had chosen. In the morning there would be wood to split, a brace to sand, water to carry, a brother's whistle from the ridge. There would be small work that added up to a life. And there would be the next turning in the trail, where something waited not to take from them, but to test the shape of what they had made, something neither storm nor paper could name, but which they would meet side by side with the kind of quiet that heals and the kind of love that holds. The first rain came like a rumor that turned out to be true. It began with a scent none of them had tasted in months, the clean metal note of water bending the air. Saka woke to it before it fell, sitting propped on her elbows as the sky lowered itself, heavy and generous. Wade was already at the door, shoulder against the frame, watching the light shift over the ridge. When the first drops struck the porch roof, slow and separate, she felt each one land somewhere in her chest and loosen what the heat had tightened. By the time the rain became a veil, the cottonwood leaves were clapping soft, and the yard drank so greedily it made a music of its own. They spent that morning moving what needed moving. Wade dragged the wagon farther into the barn, spread canvas over sacks, checked the roofline where a wind-stiff shingle had been threatening to give up since spring. Saka tied a cloth around her hair and rolled to the back door where the ramp shed water like a tongue, testing the slick with her palms before easing herself forward. Tana hauled fence posts beneath the lean-to and laughed once when a gust threatened to steal his hat and failed. Storms made the world honest. You could not pretend you had more time than you did. You did what mattered and left the rest for when the sky changed its mind. Near noon, thunder stitched a torn seam across the far hills. For a breath the rain thinned, then returned harder, slanting in from the east. A ribbon of clay, always harmless in drought, began to shine where it crossed the yard. The creek beyond the north ridge found its voice and raised it. Wade felt the shift in the ground under his boots and turned without thinking, the old soldier in him identifying a new kind of flank. Water. "We stay high," he said, already lifting the trapdoor to check the cellar that had never known a flood. "We'll take the bedrolls to the table. If the creek pushes down this far, we let it pass through." Saka nodded. Calm, more than brave. Calm knew where to set its weight. She rolled to the cupboard and began lifting what her arms could bear. The tin box with matches and flint, the bone ring she had carved, and the small figures that had accumulated at the table's edge like a council of patient creatures. Tana brought in the tools, the shovel, the axe, a coil of rope, the canvas-wrapped rifle that Wade never kept too far from reach. Wade himself worked in the doorway like a man speaking a language his hands had learned. Brace, wedge, lift, tie. When the water came, it did not arrive like a wall. It slid in low and sure, braiding itself across the yard and finding the path it had always wanted to take. The ramp took it, the porch let it pass beneath, the cabin floor darkened along the seams where boards met, and the smell rose. Earth, green, relief. Wade stood with one palm against the wall, feeling the timbers answer, a living thing riding out weather. Saka watched the water touch the first step and stop. Tana pulled his brother's knife, hers now, across a length of rope, and fashioned a sling to raise the lowest sack of meal up onto a peg. They lost nothing that mattered. The flood did what floods do. It reminded them that the land had a memory and a will. By late afternoon, the rain softened until it was only a fine mist. Water ran off edges and into hollows. The creek settled back inside its banks, muttering like a tired old man whose temper had passed. Wade stepped out first and breathed deeply, then turned back to find Saka smiling, her fingers wrapped around the wet porch rail. "You hear it?" she asked. "Peace," he said. "Work," she corrected, and the shared grin made him feel as if the rain had washed something out of him he shouldn't have been carrying. They put the house back together in the way people do who know how to make order from weather. Sacks returned to the floor. Bedrolls shook and dried. The rug went back over the trapdoor, smoothed once with Saka's palm, once with Wade's boot. Tana carried a bucket to the cottonwood and poured a little there, laughing at himself. "Unnecessary kindness," he said. "Still," Saka answered, and that word had become so many things by then, a hinge, a law, a hymn, that it needed no explanation. For 3 days after the rain, the world smelled like a promise kept. Grass woke. The hens laid with a regularity that felt almost embarrassed. Wade mended a section of fence he had been ignoring for want of a good mood and a sky that didn't bite. Saka sanded the leather edges on the braces, kneading the straps with rendered fat until the bite eased where bite had no right to be. She did not rush the standing, not now, not with the memory of water reminding her every motion belonged to time as well as will. Each morning she tied her hair high, that was her sign for iron, and stood a breath longer than the day before, then unbuckled, massaged her skin, and returned to the platform like a queen to a throne, not a patient to a bed. News travels toward quieter places the way wind finds a crack in a wall. Tana brought it 2 mornings later, the scent of horse on him, and the dust speaking where words did not want to. "Not the paper men," he said, leaning his shoulder to the door jamb. "Men who carry paper for other men who would rather not look at the people they name. They have a marshal's letter now." He slipped the folded sheet onto the table. Wade touched the edge but did not take it up. The seal was real, the name too neat, the sentence too sure of itself. Saka, absconded, held by one Wade Holt. Deliver or be delivered, consequence. Saka traced the broken ring of wax with her thumb, then met Wade's eyes. There was no request there, only recognition. "They will come," she said. "We will be here," he answered. Tana nodded once, a soldier's agreement, and left before sundown to run a line no letter could break. A quiet word with the woman in the marshal's office who kept the papers from eating the town, a nod to the storekeep who liked Wade because he paid with exact coin, a handful of seeds left on the post of a neighbor who believed in the way work looks when it is honest. They came on the 5th day, when the sun was back to its old discipline and the shade had become a held breath. 5 riders this time, 2 in coats cut to resemble uniforms, and 3 in the kind of dust that suggests men who think they are owed what they can reach. Harlan was there, hat lowered enough to look like humility if you didn't know he wore it to hide his mouth. The leader carried the letter as if it were a lariat. He kept it folded, and Saka saw that for what it was, a man believing paper was a blade that would not cut him when he held it wrong. Wade stepped onto the porch, set his feet as if he were planting a fence post exactly where it needed to go, not an inch to either side. He did not raise the shotgun. He let it rest inside the door, where his hand could know it without making the room forget it had other furniture. Saka rolled to the threshold and stopped where the beam's shadow cut a clean line. She wore the sash. The word across her chest seemed to square its shoulders. "By order of the Arizona Territorial Marshal," the man began, and the sentence was a dull iron thing until he set her name in it, and then it half snapped because the mouth that said it did not know how to carry it. "You are to come with us." "I am with my husband," Saka said, and the word turned more heads than the letter did. Harlan's eyes flicked from her face to Wade's, to the ring of bone on Wade's finger, to the small things weather had shaped into permanence. 2 chairs at the table in the dim behind them, a woman's coat on a peg, cleaned and honored, a platform worn smooth by hands that intended to return. Something in him studied those facts and found them harder to move than he had expected. "That's so?" he asked. And it wasn't a sneer. It was the question of a man who had misplaced his spine and was checking pockets. "It is," Wade said. He didn't push sound into the words. He let them be as simple as nails. He lifted his left hand, and the ring caught the light just enough to make the bone look like it had always belonged where it was. The letterman did not like any of that. Paper cannot stand a house that names itself out loud. He started to say the word custody, but the cottonwood, in a luck that would make sense only later, let go a handful of rainwater it had kept curled in its leaves. The drops spattered like applause. Everyone looked up for a heartbeat. When eyes came down again, Tana was visible where he hadn't been a moment before, under the lean of the barn roof, hat shadowed, palms open and empty, in the way a man stands when he is not threatening anything except the failure to consider him. He did not need to lift a weapon to put a shape to this place. The letter hadn't named family. "You got a warrant signed right for search or seizure?" Wade asked, not daring them, only asking a question the land itself likes to hear once in a while, to remember that law can be shaped like a fence that keeps cattle where they do not harm themselves, instead of a whip that teaches nothing. The leader unfolded the letter at last, and held it out as if distance could carry authority. Wade did not take it. He could read from where he stood, and what he read didn't change what he knew. "This house is mine," he said. "The woman is my wife. You can bring a judge, or you can bring your hunger. One of those might be worth my time." Saka felt the old panic pour once at her ribs and go lie down. She moved her platform forward an inch with the quiet of a tide. "Do you want to see what you write down?" she asked, and the question was almost kind. The youngest rider flinched as if he'd been offered a bowl he didn't know how to hold. Harlan stayed very still, as if stillness might for once be remembered in his favor. "What I write down," the leader managed, "is that you will come." "Then write this," Saka said. She pulled the blanket from her lap and let the truth stand. The scarred stumps caught the light the way river stones do when they've been polished by time that did not intend to be generous and somehow was. "Write that I lost what I lost to your iron and still breathe. Write that I found a man who does not trade pity for power. Write that I choose my ground and the people on it. Write that you were offered a seat and water and chose to keep your horse." No one moved. There are silences that warn and silences that invite. This one did the second. Harlan tipped his hat back. It was a small motion and a big one. He was not yet a man you would trust with a child or a wounded animal, but something in him recognized the weight of a life being named and could not pretend he didn't. The youngest rider swallowed like a boy who had heard a song for the first time and would not forget it. The letterman looked down at his paper, because that is what some men do when the world asks their eyes to learn a new word, and their mouth cannot. "Let me see the house," he said after a long moment, and the sentence had changed shape. It wasn't a demand. It was what a man asks when he isn't sure whether his job is to be a human being or a hinge. Wade stepped aside. He did not reach for the shotgun. He held the door with a courtesy he would have offered anyone whose boots would not drag mud where it shouldn't go. The leader walked 2 steps in and stopped. He saw the table with its 2 bowls, the shelf Wade had lowered to where Saka's hands could find it without strain, the lamp trimmed neat, the coat, the beads, the braces on the table waiting their turn with the day. He took in a breath that sounded like a man climbing down from a story he had been standing on for too long. When he turned back, Harlan had already started to shift in the saddle toward leaving, the kind of slow backing out a man does when he wants to remember he wasn't chased. The youngest had covered his mouth with his knuckles, the way some men do when they feel something that scares them in the right way. The leader folded his paper. He looked at Saka, at Wade, at Tana, at the way wind moved through the cottonwood and made the world seem busy and calm at the same time. "You keep your fence fixed," he said, which was not what he had planned to say when he woke that morning, "and your gate latched. If you go into town, go in daylight. If anyone asks, I didn't see you." "You did," Saka said. "You saw me." He held her gaze a moment longer than he might have if he were the kind of man who wanted to stay the same all his days. Then he touched his hat. Not to her, not exactly, but to the space that had opened and asked him to step through. He mounted, turned his horse without show, and left. The others followed, Harlan last, his eyes on the ring around Wade's finger as if it were a star he'd never noticed until just now. The yard held its breath until the riders were a length of dust, and then nothing. Tana exhaled first, a sound between relief and a song. Wade leaned his palm against the doorframe as if to thank it for being the right shape. Saka rested her hands on her lap for a long count of 30, then lifted the blanket again and drew it back across with care. She did not shake. The word on her chest felt warm. They ate early that night because hunger is one of the ways the body votes to remain. Tana sat on the floor with his back to the wall in the old way of men who like to see a room's edges. Wade sliced bread thinner than he needed to and stacked the slices as if order helped the loaf go farther. Saka carved a new bead without drawing blood once. When she tied it onto Wade's wrist beside the crescent, he turned his hand palm up and closed his fingers around hers, holding without grasping. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll ride into Copper Ridge. Bring back nails, salt, whatever keeps. Smile at the storekeep like I don't know how to do anything else." Saka smiled, because the thought of him smiling on purpose was as dear as the skill itself. "I'll sit in the doorway," she said. "I'll shell beans where everyone can see me not hiding from my own life." Tana nodded. "I'll ride the east," he added. "I'll wave at whatever print the dust thinks it can make of me." They slept without waiting for sleep to ask permission. Sometime after midnight, Saka woke and found the house breathing. Wade's breath, slow. Tana's, lighter, from the other side of the wall. The soft tick of a cooling stove. The cottonwood talking to itself the way trees do when they've learned the names of everyone in their shade. She slipped her fingers along Wade's wrist until they covered the beads, feeling his pulse press against the small shapes her hands had made. For a long while, she lay there and let her mind do nothing but record that she was warm, that she was safe, that she was wanted. Healing comes like that sometimes, not as a blaze, not as a trumpet, but as a list of small truths the body decides to trust. Dawn broke like a clean sentence. Tana saddled his horse while the coffee breathed in the pot. Wade buttoned his shirt wrong the first try because he was thinking 2 steps ahead about fence wire and whether the marshal's woman would have more words to spare. Saka rolled to the doorway and set herself where the light touched her shoulders. She wore her hair low, soft day, and the sash lay across her chest like a horizon. When Wade swung into the saddle, he leaned down and kissed her the way a man does who has come to understand that leaving and returning are part of the same vow. She held the stirrup leather and lifted her face to meet him. No hurry, no fear. "Bring salt," she said, "and if there's a decent length of canvas, we'll patch the wagon bed so it stops complaining." He grinned, real and unguarded. "I'll bargain like a saint," he promised, which made Tana snort, and the sound placed the morning exactly where it belonged, in the company of brothers and shared work. They watched him ride until the ridge took him. The yard felt big and kind. Saka looked at the braces on the table, at the way the leather had softened where her hands had taught it to, and decided to try again when the sun cleared the edge of the roof. She could feel the shape of what waited. Not triumph, not a banner, just another inch given back to her by a body that had not forgiven what had been done to it, and had nevertheless decided to be generous. Tana whistled a bird call from the east, and the sound came back from the cottonwood like an answer. By noon, the heat had found its old job, but no one resented it. Saka stood twice, each time a breath longer than the last, and when she lowered herself, she did not look for praise and did not find pity. Only Wade's voice in her head saying, "We follow your calendar." Only her own answering word, "Still." She shelled beans on the porch with a steady rhythm and listened to the world have opinions. A hawk wrote a sentence across the sky and ended it in the cottonwood's top. The hens announced the obvious and were pleased with themselves all over again. A cricket had found its way under the step and soared politely at the echo. Late afternoon brought the shape of a man cresting the trail at an easy pace. For a breath her ribs stiffened, habit, and then loosened when she recognized the set of the shoulders. Wade rode in with a sack of salt, a roll of canvas, a bundle of nails that chinked like a cheerful pocket, and a news that sat down at the table without shoes. "They've got fires everywhere," he said, pouring coffee like a victory. "There's a freight wagon tipped at San Miguel Creek, and half the town is busy with it. The marshal's woman says our letter grew old on his desk while men shouted other names. Harlan bought a decent hat and pretended he'd always owned it." "Less interesting," Saka said, and the relief that chased those two words through the room was not noisy. It didn't need to be. Wade set the salt on the shelf and touched her shoulder as he passed, the most ordinary benediction in the world. They ate cornbread that didn't burn this time and beans that did their work without fanfare. Tana returned at dusk and sat cross-legged on the floor, telling about a fox that had figured out how to test the henhouse door and found out it was latched. By the time the lamp gave its small sigh, the house felt like a held hand. Much later, when moonlight made a square on the floorboards and the cottonwood had turned its face towards sleep, Saka reached for Wade and found him already reaching back. They did not make a ceremony out of it. They laid their hands over the places that once had been all wound and watch, and found them easy. The quiet between them was the kind you can drink from. Home, he had called it, and tonight the word felt like a room with windows on every side, doors that knew when to close, and a table with enough chairs. Morning would bring the sound of saw and hammer, the grit of canvas being spread flat, a brother's laughter at the way nails always pretend to be in charge and never are. It would bring a slow, steady standing and a careful unbuckling and a cloth pressed to skin where leather had tried to argue. It would bring a world that had not promised safety and had somehow offered them a place to set down the weight anyway. It would bring the next turn in the trail, where love, having named itself, would have to decide again how it behaves when tested, not with paper this time perhaps, but with something that would knock at their door and ask to be answered. Saka closed her eyes and listened for that future the way a woman listens for rain in a sky that looks like it might mean it. Her palm rested on Wade's chest. His breath lifted into her hand and fell again. Tana's sleep on the other side of the wall shifted and settled. The cottonwood held its counsel. Outside, somewhere not far, the creek whispered the same lesson it had been teaching since water learned to move. Keep going, keep going, keep going. And with that in her blood, she slept, ready for whatever tomorrow would decide to be, standing if she could, seated if she must, loved either way. And the house, grateful to belong to people who understood how to hold quiet like a lamp, kept watch until the first edges of light touched the ridge and asked them gently to rise. By late summer, the valley learned their names, not because anyone carved them into posts or spoke them loudly at the saloon, but because the small things, fences that held, a ramp planed smooth, a lamp that never smoked, began to look like two people had promised the same life and kept it. Morning arrived with the same benevolent stubbornness each day. Wade lit the stove while the cottonwood rinsed light through its leaves. Saka rolled to the doorway and let the first wind touch her face, the sash across her chest settling like a horizon she had chosen. The creek, no longer mean with heat, moved in a steady voice that felt like prayer. Keep going, keep going, keep going. They went to town on a Tuesday because Tuesdays were quieter. Wade tied Brisk to the post outside Fenlow's store and offered his arm as if the gesture were habit, not pity. Saka took it without apology. The platform she used for the boardwalk had new brass on its wheels. She had polished it the night before until it caught the sun and returned it brighter. People looked, and then they looked away because the world had taught them to. And then some of them looked back the way you look when you remember you still have a heart. The lady behind the counter, who everyone called Miss Bess, handed Saka a length of cloth, unasked. "For edges," she said, "edges shouldn't bite." It was the color of wet clay. Saka smoothed a corner between her fingers and nodded once, which was all the thanks Miss Bess needed. They stayed long enough to trade coins for salt, coffee, and a little sugar, long enough for Tana to speak low with the woman in the marshal's office, whose desk always looked like it was one sigh away from forgiving the world its paperwork. When they left, no one followed. The ridge took them back into a country that did not ask for letters to prove a life was real. Wade's hand found Saka's on the seat beside him whenever the wagon jolted. She squeezed once, a small pulse of reassurance. "We belong here." He answered by the way he shifted his weight to take the worst of the ruts, the old soldier in him choosing gentleness over grit wherever he could. Back home, the braces waited on the table, clean, the leather softened with fat, the wood curved to the line of what remained and what would rise. They tried again after they'd put the sacks away and fed the hens. The cottonwood held its breath, so did the house. Tana stood where she could see him without having to turn. Wade buckled each strap with a calm the hands learn when the heart is steady. Saka set her palms flat on the table, gathered herself from center to edge, and climbed a little more than the last time. The pain spoke, but not with cruelty. She took it like weather, like an honest weight. When she stood, the air changed the way it does when shadow moves, and you suddenly notice that light has always been working. It lasted the length of a prayer. Then she lowered herself and breathed like a woman who has returned from a far place carrying news. Wade pressed his thumb along the place the leather had argued, soothing the heat from the skin. "Your calendar," he said. "We keep to it." She smiled, soft and fierce at once. "We do," she answered. And in that there was a home. Days grew a keel of ordinary. Wade repaired the side gate with Tana, while Saka carved a set of little animals for Miss Bess's window, a hawk, a coyote, a mule with a patient face. When she brought them on the next Tuesday, people actually stopped to look, pointing gently as if attention itself were a kind of blessing. Miss Bess set the animals on a blue cloth and arranged them so the hawk seemed to be watching the mule like an older cousin. "You'll bring more," she declared, not a question. and Saka found herself saying yes to a future that included a corner in a shop. One dusk, Harlan appeared at the fence line, hat in his hands. He did not approach the porch. He looked smaller without his meanness. "Got a hat that fits," he said, trying for a smile. It came out like a surrender. Wade nodded once. Saka waited. "I told a man in San Miguel that I'd seen no one," Harlan continued, eyes on the cottonwood, the way people look at something steady when they want to be steadier. Which was true enough. "I saw only folks living." He kept his hands open, empty. Learned that from a better man. "If you need word ran east or west, I owe you." Wade said nothing for a while. Then he surprised them all by handing Harlan the sack of eggs they'd planned to trade. "Bring these to Miss Bess," he said, "and tell her the hawk sold." Harlan nodded so hard his hat nearly left his grip. He left like a man who wanted to be the kind of person another might call neighbor someday. Autumn colored the edges of things without ever admitting it had come to the desert. Mornings were kinder to the lungs. The creek wore a skin of light that looked like it might break if you didn't treat it respectfully. They gathered mesquite beans and ground them to sweet meal, laughing at the way the dust stuck to their arms and made constellations. Tana built a small shelter near the North Ridge, not far enough to be gone, far enough to have a door of his own. He said he slept better with both roofs in earshot. Saka stitched him a roll of canvas for weather and tied a bone bead at one corner so he would not forget his way back. The colt came on a day when the sky carried that pale blue that means good news might be trying to find you. Brisk had wandered to the creek and returned with a smaller shadow at his flank, a gangly, uncertain creature with ears too large and a star on its forehead that looked like a thumbprint. It followed Brisk to the fence and then stood there, undecided, the way the soul of a traveller stands at a door that smells like soup. Saka teased oats into her palm and held still. The colt considered, stepped, considered again, then touched its muzzle to her skin as if asking the body's oldest question. "Are you safe?" "Dawn," she said, because the light on its back made the name unavoidable. It stayed. She added a new schedule to the house without telling anyone. She rolled out every morning to brush Dawn while Wade tended to the cattle, and Tana checked the fence. It was the kind of routine that teaches gratitude without lecture. The colt learned her voice, her scent, the rhythm of her rolling platform. When she stood with the braces, it pressed its nose to her shoulder and breathed, unafraid of odd shapes, unafraid of quiet. Winter came with its box of smaller sounds, a stove ticking, boots left near the door, breathing back the day's cold, a house learning how to hold warmth without wasting it. Saka stitched a heavier blanket from strips of shirts Wade had ruined with work, and could not let go. She sewed the word still along the hem in tiny thread, so small you had to sit and really look to find it. It comforted her that the word could be everywhere at once and nowhere oppressive. On nights when wind visited, Wade told stories from fields far away about seeds and songs and a mother who had never learned to sing on tune and who had never let that stop her. Saka spoke of grasslands and thunderheads and the time she accidentally caused a stampede of children because her laugh had fallen into their games like a dare. Tana talked less than both of them combined and still managed to be the kindest noise in the room. On the longest night of the year, Wade brought a horseshoe in from the barn, cleaned the rust, heated it in the coals, and hammered it into a rough circle on the porch stone. "It's not pretty," he warned, which was how you could tell he wanted it to be more perfect than a thing needs to be. Saka took it from him with a tenderness usually reserved for living creatures and ran her fingers over the cooled metal. "It's a ring," she said. "It's us." He slid it onto a leather thong and tied it beside the bone band at his wrist. He did not need anything else to keep the vows they had already been living, but the ring made what the days had said out loud. The threats did not vanish, they never do, but they learned to pass like weather. The marshal's woman, whose own life was held together by lists and a spine forged under someone's foolishness, found a way to misplace Saka's letter permanently in a drawer that opened often and gave up nothing. Riders still appeared now and then with the appetite of men who had not been taught the difference between hunger and cruelty, but they left with the taste of humble in their mouths without understanding why. It was not just the sight of a shotgun in a quiet man's hands or a brother waiting in a barn's shadow. It was, more confusingly for them, the sight of a woman in a chair who looked at them with welcome if welcome was deserved, and with indifference if it was not. The human heart has trouble fighting a person who has already chosen peace and is not performing it for anyone. Spring returned as if it had always intended to, rolling green back into the hollows and putting small gold tongues on the ends of shrubs. Saka stood longer and walked one measured step, then two. She left no deeper mark on the floor than before, but the house seemed to stand taller because she had. Wade learned the exact pressure to use on the muscles of her back and shoulders, strong enough to help, soft enough to heal. Tana took the braces apart and sanded a curve that had been asking to be listened to. Dawn grew into a creature with a sense of humor. It liked to pull at Wade's hat and then stand still, as if innocence had been invented for it alone. On the morning they decided to make their vows out loud, it was not for paper, not for permission, but because speaking truth has its own medicine. They invited no one and everyone, the cottonwood, the creek, the hawk, the house, the ghosts who had learned to keep company instead of terror. Wade wore the cleanest shirt he owned. Saka wore the blue cloth Miss Bess had insisted on charging too little for. Tana stood near enough to hear and far enough to give the words room to grow. Wade said, "I will carry what I can and tell the truth when I cannot." And Saka felt something loosen in her chest that had never been hers to hold in the first place. She said, "I will choose this home every day, even on days when the sky forgets we live under it." And Wade felt the room of his life add windows he had never tried to open. Tana, who had not planned to speak, said nothing, and then everything. He lifted his palm, placed it over each of their hearts in turn, and then laid it against the cottonwood's bark. The tree did not move, but it received the touch like a cathedral takes a footstep. They did not kiss like stories say you must. They stood in the same piece of light and breathed together until the air learned the shape of their promise. Work did not end because vows had been spoken. Fences still cut their hands, sacks still needed carrying. There were days Saka could not stand, and days Wade's hip remembered every bad road, and days Tana carried the world a little quieter because grief had sent him a letter with no return address. But the house kept its appointments with dawn and with soup. The creek kept writing its long sentence. Dawn learned to stand still for a blanket, and to come when Saka whistled low. Miss Bess sold every small animal Saka carved and placed a hand-painted sign near the window, "Made where the wind is kind." On a day made bright with clean wind, Saka wheeled to the edge of the creek and asked Wade to bring the braces. She did not say why. He didn't ask. He buckled them as he always did, slow and certain. She took his hands and stood, then took one step, then another, until the creek's edge was close enough for the water to put its cool breath on her shins. "I want to give back," she said, and untied the bead she had carved long ago, the one that meant day. She placed it under a stone where the bank curved, a small altar no one would notice unless they had learned to pay attention. Tana watched from the slope above and sang a thin, strong thread of a song that had been waiting in his chest since he was a boy. Wade did not sing, but he bent his head and let the wind move his hair as if he were being blessed. "What is it you're returning?" Wade asked later, when the water had taken the light and thrown it back as if happy to transport messages. Saka didn't answer for a breath. Then she said, "I'm returning the day that tried to take me. I was given it anyway. It doesn't belong to me. But what happened after? That's ours." Wade nodded and placed his palm over the bead in memory, the way a man touches the shoulder of someone who has told the truth. That evening they ate early because the sky wanted them outside when it set itself on fire. Saka leaned back against Wade on the porch bench, the wood warm with the day it had held. Tana lay in the grass with Dawn's head on his stomach, a ridiculous arrangement that made him grin at the sky without expecting it to notice. The cottonwood had never been greener. The hawk wrote its old, trustworthy paragraph and then folded the page. "What word would you use now?" Wade asked into the quiet that wasn't empty. "Home," Saka said, and then another. "Peace." She tried a third and smiled. "Grace." The syllables felt like cool water in the mouth. Wade whispered her name in answer, because sometimes the holiest thing you can do is say the name of the person who made your life a place you would gladly wake up in. They sat there until stars began to appear in the vague arithmetic that makes you think you can count what cannot be counted. They went inside when the house, pleased to share sleep with them again, made that small sound old wood makes when it's content. In the night, Wade woke and listened, as he had on the first nights, and heard the difference. Not the breath of a person trying not to drown, but the breath of someone who had become sure. He lay his hand over her heart and felt it answer. She turned sleepily and pressed her chin against his wrist where the bone ring rested against the horseshoe circle, and the two strange oaths spoke softly to each other. Dawn came gently, as if reluctant to interrupt. Tana's whistle carried from the ridge, and the day began to stack itself the way work does when love has learned to lead it. They stood again, and sat again, and laughed, and were silent without loneliness, which is a miracle people forget to count. The threats, when they came, found a door that did not open easily, and a window that let light out as fiercely as it let it in. Word travelled in a different direction now, not of a bounty to be collected, but of a place where two people had stitched the torn edges of their lives together and were offering the pattern to anyone who needed it. If this story brought you a breath of warmth or a little healing, if it reminded you that love can be quiet and still be strong, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video, subscribe to stay close for the next chapters, and share a comment about the moment that touched you most. Your voice matters here. Let it sit with ours.